Hey guys, tonight we begin with an empire that conquered the known world but couldn't conquer its own insecurity about hair color. Ancient Rome, where military genius coexisted with the desperate belief that blonde was better, where senators debated philosophy while their wives sat in the sun, coating their heads with pigeon dung and lye. An empire sophisticated enough to build the Pantheon, but convinced that golden hair was worth poisoning yourself to achieve. If this sounds like your kind of historical absurdity, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Candle History. Let me know in the comments what time it is where you are, and whether you've ever done anything regrettable to your hair. Now pour something comfortable, settle in, and let's explore how Rome turned self-destruction into a beauty ritual without causing mass panic in the process. When you think of ancient Rome, you probably picture marble statues, Latin inscriptions, and sensible people in togas making rational decisions. The reality was considerably stranger. This was a civilization that somehow convinced itself that the barbarians they'd spent centuries fighting had figured out the secret to perfect beauty. The Germanic and Celtic tribes flooding across the Rhine and Danube were Rome's existential threat, their military nightmare, the people who would eventually tear the empire apart. But they had blonde hair, naturally blonde hair, and Rome wanted it desperately. The obsession didn't happen overnight. Early Republican Rome valued darker features that reflected Mediterranean heritage. Brown hair, olive skin, the look of people who'd spent generations farming Italian soil under a merciless sun. But as Rome expanded, as legions marched through Gaul and Germania, as blonde slaves flooded the markets, something shifted in the Roman aesthetic imagination. Exotic became erotic. Foreign became fashionable. The very people Rome was trying to exterminate became Rome's beauty standard. It's the kind of psychological contradiction that would have fascinated Freud if he'd been around. Rome's military spent their days killing blonde barbarians, while Rome's aristocracy spent their nights trying to look like them. Senators who gave speeches about Roman superiority and Mediterranean virtue went home to wives who were systematically destroying their hair trying to achieve the golden color of the enemy. The irony was apparently lost on everyone involved. The shift accelerated during the late Republic and early Empire. As more Germanic and Gallic people entered Rome as slaves, servants, and hostages, their appearance became associated with luxury and conquest. To have a blonde slave wasn't just about labor. It was about displaying your connection to Rome's expanding power. Your household contained proof that Rome had reached the distant north and brought back its treasures, including genetic diversity that Mediterranean people couldn't naturally produce. Women noticed. Roman women, whose social power came almost entirely through appearance and marriage, understood that fashion was politics by other means. If blonde hair signaled status, if it attracted male attention, if it suggested connection to luxury and exotic conquest, then blonde hair became necessary. Not optional, not a preference, necessary for social survival in a competitive aristocratic world where women's value was constantly judged and ranked. The problem was chemistry. You can't just decide to be blonde if you're genetically Mediterranean. Your body produces eumelanin, the pigment that makes hair brown or black, and it's remarkably resistant to removal. To go blonde, you need to break down that melanin structure, destroy the chemical bonds that create dark color, and somehow not destroy your entire scalp in the process. Rome had no understanding of organic chemistry, no knowledge of molecular structure, nothing approaching scientific hair care. What they had was trial and error, folk wisdom from conquered territories, and a willingness to experiment on themselves that bordered on self-harm. The techniques varied, but they shared a common thread of being absolutely terrible for human health. The most common method involved creating a paste from alkaline substances like quicklime, wood ash, or lye, mixing it with various oils and plant materials, then applying it to the hair for hours while sitting in direct sunlight. The alkaline compounds attacked the melanin. The oils supposedly protected the scalp from chemical burns, and the sun accelerated the reaction through what we now recognize as oxidation. Did it work? Sometimes. Did it damage hair beyond repair? Almost always. Did it cause scalp burns, hair loss, and probably systemic poisoning through absorption? Absolutely. But it could lighten hair from dark brown to something approaching golden, and in Rome's aesthetic economy, that made the suffering worthwhile. Women would literally sit for hours with toxic paste coating their heads, baking under Mediterranean sun, all to achieve a color that Germanic slaves were born with naturally. The recipes were elaborate and disgusting. Pliny the Elder, who documented everything he encountered with the enthusiasm of a man who'd eventually die investigating a volcanic eruption too closely, recorded multiple hair lightening formulas. One involved mixing goat fat with beechwood ashes. Another required decomposing leeches mixed with vinegar and left in a lead vessel for 2 months. Lead. The Romans put lead everywhere, in their wine, their cosmetics, their water pipes, and apparently their hair treatments. The chronic lead poisoning probably explains some of Rome's more creative political decisions. Pigeon dung featured prominently in several recipes. The Romans had noticed that bird droppings contained ammonia, which has legitimate bleaching properties. What they didn't understand was dosage, application safety, or the concept that smearing feces on your head might have downsides beyond the obvious social ones. Women applied these mixtures, sat in the sun, and hoped the smell would fade before their next social engagement. Other formulas used saffron, which costs more than gold by weight to add golden tones to lightened hair. Chamomile appeared in gentler recipes, demonstrating that Romans occasionally stumbled onto things that actually worked through something other than chemical warfare against their own bodies. Vine ash was popular, probably because it was readily available in a wine-producing culture. The variety of techniques suggests desperate experimentation, women trading recipes and horror stories, trying to find something that worked without complete hair loss. The process wasn't a quick fix. Achieving significant lightening required repeated applications over weeks or months. Each treatment damaged hair structure, making it brittle and prone to breaking. Women wealthy enough to afford it used elaborate conditioning treatments with olive oil, honey, and various botanical extracts, trying to repair the damage they'd just inflicted. The whole cycle was self-perpetuating. Lighten hair, damage hair, condition hair, lighten again. A beauty treadmill that kept women occupied and kept various industries profitable. The sun was crucial to most bleaching methods. Roman women would sit on their roofs or in gardens, heads covered in toxic paste, using special wide-brimmed hats with openings at the crown that let hair spread out for maximum sun exposure, while protecting faces from tanning. These hats, called solaria, became status symbols themselves. You could tell a woman was wealthy enough to spend hours doing nothing productive by whether she owned elaborate sun-bleaching equipment. The class dynamics were fascinating. Aristocratic women had time for this nonsense. Slaves and working-class women couldn't spend entire days sitting in the sun destroying their hair. So blonde hair became a marker of leisure, of having enough wealth that you didn't need to do actual work. The woman whose hair was lightest had demonstrated the most dramatic devotion to appearance, the most complete embrace of fashionable suffering. She'd won the competition by being willing to endure more than her rivals. But chemical treatments could only go so far. For women who wanted truly golden hair, for those who couldn't tolerate the chemical assault, or for those whose hair had already been destroyed by too many treatments, Rome offered an alternative solution: wigs. Wigs made from the hair of people who'd been born blonde, cut from the heads of Germanic and Gallic slaves, processed into fashionable styles, and sold at prices that would make modern luxury goods seem reasonable. The wig trade was its own industry. Entire workshops specialized in processing hair, sorting it by color and quality, weaving it into various styles suitable for Roman fashion. Blonde hair commanded premium prices, with the lightest shades worth small fortunes. A single high-quality blonde wig could cost what a skilled laborer earned in months. The market was sophisticated, with dealers, authenticators, and probably the ancient equivalent of counterfeiters, trying to pass off dyed hair as naturally blonde. The sourcing was grim. Much of the hair came from slaves captured during Rome's endless wars along the northern frontier. When Germanic tribes were defeated, when villages were sacked, women and children were taken captive and eventually sold in Roman markets. Their blonde hair was an additional commodity, something that could be harvested and sold separately from their labor. Some slaves were specifically valued for their hair, kept in conditions that maximized hair growth, then periodically sheared like sheep. The dehumanization was complete. They'd become living hair factories. Other hair came from the dead. After battles, corpses were stripped of valuables, including hair, if it was sufficiently blonde. There are accounts of merchants following armies, collecting whatever could be sold from the battlefield dead. Hair didn't decay like flesh. It could be cleaned, processed, sold. A dead Germanic warrior's hair might end up adorning a Roman senator's wife at dinner parties, a grotesque form of trophy-taking disguised as fashion. Some women employed blonde slaves specifically to grow hair that could be periodically cut and added to wigs, creating a renewable hair source. These slaves were fed well, kept healthy, their hair carefully maintained, because it represented investment. The psychological horror of being valued primarily as a hair source, of having your appearance harvested piece by piece, doesn't seem to have troubled anyone with the power to stop it. The wig industry required craftsmanship. Creating a convincing wig that looked like natural hair required skilled workers who understood how to blend colors, create realistic hairlines, secure the piece to the wearer's head. The best wig makers were artists, though working in a medium that most people would find disturbing. They knew techniques for matching skin tones, creating styles that flattered different face shapes, making pieces that could withstand movement and weather without obvious artificiality. Wealthy women owned multiple wigs in different styles and shades. Blonde for formal occasions, darker pieces for different contexts, elaborate constructions for special events. A woman's wig collection represented significant investment, comparable to her jewelry or clothing. Wigs were maintained by specialized slaves who cleaned, styled, and repaired them. An entire hierarchy of servants existed just to manage aristocratic women's fake hair. The social dynamics around wigs were complex. Everyone knew who wore them. There was no pretense that these were natural, but acknowledging it directly was rude, especially if the woman in question had status. Polite society maintained the fiction while understanding the reality. It was theater that everyone participated in, a collective agreement to treat artificial blonde hair as if it indicated something meaningful about the wearer. Men's attitudes were contradictory. Roman men wrote poems celebrating blonde hair, praising women whose golden locks reminded them of goddesses. The same men would mock women in private for their vanity, for the expense of wigs, for the chemicals they used. They wanted women to be beautiful, but despised the effort required to achieve beauty.
It was a no-win situation that women navigated through performance and discretion.
The blonde obsession wasn't purely about individual vanity. It reflected Rome's complicated relationship with its own expansion. As the empire grew, as Rome incorporated more diverse populations, Roman identity became unstable. What did it mean to be Roman when half the empire wasn't from Rome? When the Senate included members from Spain, Gaul, Syria? Hair color became one way to mark status, to claim connection to an imagined purity that had never really existed. Blonde hair paradoxically represented both foreign conquest and Roman superiority. Some moralists condemned the blonde craze as decadence, as evidence of Roman decline. They'd write treatises about how ancestral Romans valued darker features, how bleaching hair represented contamination by foreign aesthetics. These same moralists usually went home to wives who owned blonde wigs. Hypocrisy was as Roman as the Forum. Everyone condemned practices they participated in, maintained public virtue while practicing private vice. Religious authorities occasionally weighed in, declaring that altering hair color was an insult to the gods who'd created you with specific features. These pronouncements had approximately zero effect on behavior. Roman religion was transactional. You made offerings, performed rituals, got divine favor in return. The gods had bigger concerns than hair dye. If they objected, they'd send a sign. Until then, women would keep chemically burning their scalps in pursuit of fashion. The medical establishment, such as it existed, recognized the dangers. Physicians like Galen wrote about hair loss, scalp damage, and suspected systemic effects from chemical absorption. They'd recommend gentler alternatives like henna for reddish tones or various herbal rinses that wouldn't cause burns. Their advice was largely ignored by women who understood that gentle treatments didn't produce dramatic results. In the competition for male attention and social status, half measures failed. The process of creating blonde hair through chemicals required timing, precision, and acceptance of risk. A woman didn't just slap poison on her head and hope. She'd consult with experienced slaves, review recipes, prepare her scalp with protective oils. The application was systematic, working section by section, ensuring even coverage while trying to minimize skin contact. It was chemistry without understanding chemistry, building procedures through observation of what worked and what caused irreversible damage. After application, the waiting began. Hours sitting motionless, feeling the mixture dry and tighten, trying to ignore the burning sensation that indicated your scalp was losing the chemical war. Some women read during this period. Others had slaves recite poetry or gossip to pass the time. The waiting was part of the ritual, the suffering that validated the transformation. If achieving blonde hair was easy, it wouldn't signal dedication to beauty standards. Removal required care equal to application. The hardened paste had to be softened with oils, gently washed away, the hair carefully rinsed to remove all residue. Remaining chemicals would continue damaging hair and scalp, causing the very problems women were trying to avoid. The aftercare was almost as elaborate as the initial treatment, with conditioning agents and protective treatments trying to mitigate the destruction. The results were temporary. As hair grew, dark roots appeared, creating the timeless problem of maintenance that modern hair dye users understand intimately. Roman women faced the same choice. Let it grow out naturally, revealing the artificial nature of their blonde color, or repeat the chemical assault every few weeks, progressively damaging their hair until significant loss became inevitable. Many chose the latter, maintaining the fiction until biology forced a reckoning. Hair loss from chemical treatments was common enough that Romans developed specialized products to address it. Various tonics claimed to restore hair growth, probably with the same effectiveness as modern snake oil. But they sold well to desperate women who destroyed their hair pursuing beauty and now needed solutions to the problems they'd created. The cycle was perfect from a merchant's perspective. Sell the chemicals that destroy hair, then sell the treatments that supposedly fix it. Wigs became necessary for women whose chemical experiments had ended in disaster. A woman who'd lost significant hair to bleaching couldn't simply stop being beautiful. Social expectations remained constant regardless of the damage she'd done to herself. Wigs allowed continuation of the performance, covering the evidence of failed chemistry with purchased blonde hair. It was problem-solving through commerce, which was perhaps the most Roman approach possible. The younger generation often started earlier, having watched their mothers and aunts go through the process. Teenage girls began lightening their hair before it was fully dark, trying to stay ahead of melanin production. This created lifelong dependence on chemical treatments or wigs, setting up decades of expense and damage. But it prevented the visible contrast between natural darkness and artificial blonde, maintaining a more convincing illusion. Some women gave up entirely, deciding that dark hair was acceptable or even preferable. These women risked social stigma, but avoided the physical cost of constant chemical warfare. They represented either rebellion against beauty standards or pragmatic calculation that the cost exceeded the benefit. Either way, they were minority voices in a culture that had collectively agreed blonde was better. The geographic variation in this obsession is telling. In Rome itself, where status competition was most intense, blonde hair was nearly universal among aristocratic women. In provincial cities, the standards were slightly more relaxed. In rural areas, the whole thing was often ignored. The fashion was urban, elite, tied to specific social contexts where appearance determined position.
A farmer's wife in rural Italy had no reason to bleach her hair because the status signaling meant nothing in her context.
Military families stationed on the German frontier had complex relationships with blonde hair. They were surrounded by naturally blonde barbarians who they'd been sent to fight. Adopting their appearance felt like capitulation to some, exotic cosmopolitanism to others. Military wives navigated this by emphasizing the artificial nature of their blonde hair. They weren't trying to be Germanic. They were Roman enough to force Germanic aesthetics into Roman frameworks through chemistry and commerce. You've been with me for a while now, and if you're still here contemplating the absurdity of an empire-wide hair-dyeing obsession, candle history has plenty more historical weirdness waiting. The subscribe button's there if you want it. The elaborate procedures around hair lightening weren't just practical chemistry. They were ritual systems that transformed dangerous, potentially disfiguring practices into socially acceptable beauty routines. The genius was in making self-harm look like self-care through systematic procedures that minimized visible disasters. If women had randomly slapped chemicals on their heads and walked around with chemical burns and hair loss, the practice would have triggered social panic. Instead, Rome developed elaborate protocols that made disaster seem like acceptable risk. The protocols began with consultation. A woman didn't attempt hair lightening alone. She consulted with experienced slaves, often Greek or Egyptian women who'd brought their own beauty knowledge to Rome. These consultants would examine hair texture, scalp sensitivity, previous treatments, and recommend specific approaches. The consultation itself was theater, creating the impression of medical precision around what was fundamentally guesswork and tradition. Preparation rituals gave the process legitimacy. Hair would be washed with specific cleansers, conditioned with protective oils, examined section by section. This wasn't strictly necessary for the chemistry, but it created space between normal life and chemical transformation. The preparation said, "This is important enough to require ceremony." The ritual transformed potential disaster into controlled procedure, managing anxiety through systematic action. The application environment mattered. Women didn't bleach their hair in public spaces where accidents would be visible. They used private chambers, gardens, rooftop terraces accessible only to household members and trusted slaves. The privacy protected reputation, ensuring that disasters could be managed quietly without becoming public scandals. A woman whose treatment went wrong could hide while her hair recovered or while a wig was prepared. Multiple people participated in applications, creating oversight and shared responsibility. One slave prepared the mixture, another applied it, a third monitored timing, a fourth stood ready with removal materials if the woman showed distress.
The distributed roles meant no single person bore full responsibility if something went wrong. It also created efficiency and allowed specialized knowledge to develop. The slave who'd applied treatments hundreds of times understood nuances that written recipes couldn't capture.
Timing was ritualized through various methods. Some households used water clocks, measuring treatment duration precisely. Others used oil lamps, marking passage of time by how much oil burned. Some had slaves recite specific poems or texts, with length of recitation determining treatment time. These weren't arbitrary. They were ways of standardizing procedure across treatments, learning what durations produced results without excessive damage.
The sun and exposure component became its own ceremony. Women didn't just sit outside. They adopted specific postures, used specialized equipment, followed procedures that had been tested across generations. The solarium hat positioned hair for optimal exposure. Slaves would periodically check coloring progress, adjust positioning, ensure even treatment. The whole process looked deliberate and controlled, medical rather than desperate.
Removal procedures were equally systematic. Specific oils in specific sequences, particular washing techniques, standardized conditioning treatments. Women didn't improvise. They followed established protocols that had been refined through observation of what minimized damage. The system worked not because Romans understood chemistry, but because they developed empirical methods through extensive and probably painful trial and error. Recovery periods between treatments were enforced through custom and slave oversight. A woman who just chemically assaulted her scalp couldn't immediately repeat the process. Recovery time let skin heal, let hair condition itself, prevented the cumulative damage that would lead to obvious destruction. The mandatory waiting was presented as beauty wisdom, but functioned as safety protocol. Record keeping helped manage the process. Wealthy households maintained notes on which preparations worked, what timing produced best results, how different women responded to various formulas. This created institutional knowledge that could be referenced, shared among households, refined over time. It was experimental science without theory, building practical understanding through documentation and iteration. The slave hierarchy around hair treatments created expertise and accountability. Senior slaves who'd successfully managed hundreds of treatments without disasters gained status and authority. Junior slaves learned through apprenticeship, handling less critical tasks until they demonstrated competence. This professionalization meant expertise accumulated and transferred across generations. Knowledge didn't die with individuals, it became institutional. Communication protocols managed the social risks. Aristocratic women could discuss their hair treatments among themselves, sharing recipes and horror stories. But they didn't discuss them with men or in mixed social settings. The privacy kept the worst aspects of the process hidden from male judgment, while allowing women to share knowledge they needed for safe practice. It was information management through social convention. Medical consultation became part of the routine for wealthy women. Physicians couldn't stop the practice, but they could monitor for serious problems, recommend recovery treatments, advise when someone's pursuit of blonde hair had become genuinely dangerous. This medical integration made the whole thing seem more respectable, less like vanity and more like health management. Physicians got paid, women got legitimacy, everyone won, except maybe the women's hair. The normalization extended to commercial establishments. Shops specializing in beauty preparations didn't hide in back alleys. They operated openly near forums and baths, advertising their wares, competing on quality and price. The public commerce signaled that hair lighting was acceptable, normal, something respectable women did. If it was available in shops near temples and government buildings, it couldn't be too scandalous. Social pressure maintained the rituals. Women who skipped preparation steps, who rushed timing, who didn't follow recovery protocols were seen as reckless and foolish if they experienced problems. The community response wasn't sympathy, but judgment. You didn't follow the proper procedures, so your disaster is your fault. This enforcement mechanism ensured that most women adhered to established practices, maintaining the overall safety level that prevented widespread visible disasters. The economic system reinforced proper practice. Quality ingredients cost money. Skilled slaves cost money. Medical consultation cost money. Cheap attempts using inferior materials were more likely to cause disasters. Women with resources could afford safer procedures. Women without resources who wanted blonde hair had to accept higher risk. This created a feedback loop where successful hair lightening signaled wealth and wise resource management. Seasonal timing became customary. Women typically started bleaching programs in late winter or early spring, giving themselves months before summer social season. This prevented the rushed treatments that caused problems and allowed multiple applications to build color gradually. The calendar structure created natural pacing, preventing the compressed timelines that led to visible disasters. Public displays of successful blonde hair validated the entire system. When aristocratic women appeared at events with golden hair that looked healthy and beautiful, it demonstrated that the procedures worked. The visible successes outweighed the hidden failures, maintaining faith in the system. No one saw the women hiding at home with chemical burns or destroyed hair. They only saw the successes, creating survivorship bias that perpetuated the practices. The language used around hair treatments emphasized control and science. Women didn't damage their hair with poison in conversation. They treated their hair with preparations,
following traditional methods and medical advice. The vocabulary made dangerous chemistry sound like legitimate medicine, managing perception through linguistic choices. How you described something shaped how people thought about it. Failure management was built into the system through wigs. When chemical treatments destroyed hair beyond repair, wigs provided seamless transition. A woman could maintain her blonde presentation while her natural hair recovered underneath. The wig industry wasn't just commerce, it was failure insurance that let women take risks with their hair knowing that total disaster could be covered. This safety net made people bolder in their experimentation. The younger generation entering the practice received education from older women, learning not just how to achieve blonde hair, but how to do it within the established ritual framework. This mentorship ensured procedure consistency across generations, preventing each new cohort from having to rediscover safety practices through painful experience. Knowledge accumulated and transferred, making the whole system progressively safer over time. Social events themselves reinforced the rituals through timing expectations. If everyone knew that achieving proper blonde hair took months of careful treatment, then sudden changes were suspicious and possibly dangerous. Women couldn't fake the results with a rushed job. They had to follow the rituals, and the timeline of the rituals created accountability and safety. The integration with religious calendar was subtle but real. Treatment sequences often aligned with festivals and holy days, not because the gods cared about hair color, but because the festival structure provided natural timing markers. Begin treatments after the Saturnalia, first sun exposure after the Lupercalia, completion before the Floralia. Religious calendar gave secular vanity a framework. Artistic representations of the process always showed it as controlled and dignified. Paintings and mosaics depicted women calmly receiving treatments, surrounded by attentive slaves in beautiful settings. The imagery never showed burns, tears, disasters. It presented the idealized version, reinforcing the narrative that proper procedures prevented problems. Art shaped expectation and therefore behavior. The philosophical justifications framed hair lightening as reasonable personal maintenance rather than dangerous vanity. Stoic philosophers might condemn excessive focus on appearance, but they'd phrase it in terms of proportion and balance. Moderate attention to appearance was appropriate for a Roman woman's social role. The question was degree, not absolute prohibition. This intellectual framework made the whole practice defensible. Male participation in maintaining the rituals came through providing resources and tacit approval. A husband who funded his wife's expensive treatments, who purchased high-quality ingredients, who didn't object to her spending hours on appearance, was participating in the system. His enabling made the practice possible and therefore legitimate. The rituals worked because both genders invested in their success. Legal frameworks supported the system indirectly by regulating the wig trade, quality standards for cosmetic ingredients, contracts with beauty slaves. Law didn't explicitly endorse hair lightening, but it created commercial structures that facilitated safe practice. This regulatory environment signaled official tolerance and therefore social acceptability. The procedures even incorporated elements of plausible deniability. A woman could claim her blonde hair came from sun exposure during summer, from natural color variation, from anything except chemicals. The rituals allowed maintaining this fiction. If the process looked medical and gradual, the result could be explained as natural. The systematic approach enabled the deception. Recovery treatments after lightening became their own ritual category. Honey masks, oil treatments, herbal rinses, all designed to repair damage and restore hair health. These recovery rituals were almost as elaborate as the lightening procedures, creating a continuous cycle of treatment and recovery that kept the whole system perpetuating itself. The rituals managing damage from previous rituals required new rituals infinitely. Written records of procedures, preserved on wax tablets or papyrus, created authoritative sources that could be consulted and referenced. When someone questioned a practice, the documentation provided evidence that this was established tradition, not reckless experimentation. Textual authority legitimized what might otherwise seem like collective madness. The geographic spread of the practices through Roman culture followed the same ritual patterns. As Roman fashion reached provinces, the procedures traveled with it, complete with all the systematic approaches that made them work. Provincial women didn't have to reinvent safe practice. They could import the entire ritual system, adapting it to local materials while maintaining core procedures. Even critics of the practice engaged within the ritual framework. Moralists who condemned blonde hair didn't argue the procedures were unsafe. They argued they were vain or foreign. By accepting the procedural validity while objecting to the motivation, they reinforced the system. Debate focused on should we rather than can we safely, keeping the conversation in moral rather than practical territory. The confidence the system created was its own justification. Women who'd successfully lightened their hair felt they'd mastered complex procedures, demonstrated discipline and dedication. The difficulty of safe practice made success meaningful, transforming dangerous chemistry into personal achievement. The rituals created expertise, and expertise created status. What's remarkable is how well this worked. Rome sustained elaborate chemical hair modification across centuries without it becoming a social catastrophe. Yes, individual women suffered disasters. Yes, some died from poisoning, but the majority navigated the practice successfully enough that it remained normal rather than notorious. The ritual systems, the procedures, the institutional knowledge all combine to make inherently dangerous behavior feel controlled and therefore acceptable. The modern parallels are obvious. We don't use lead and pigeon dung anymore, but we still chemically modify our hair in ways that cause damage. We still pursue appearance standards that require ongoing maintenance and risk. We still build elaborate ritual systems around beauty practices that are, at base, slightly insane. The hair salon, with its systematic procedures, its trained professionals, its specialized equipment, that's Rome's ritual system with better chemistry. The obsession with blonde hair specifically persists in many cultures, still coded as more attractive, more valuable, worth the cost and risk of artificial lightening. The association between blonde and beauty that Rome helped establish has remarkable staying power across centuries. Modern hair dye is safer than Roman formulas, but the psychological drivers are remarkably similar. We want what we don't naturally have. We're willing to endure discomfort to get it. The economic parallels are perfect. Modern beauty industry, like Rome's, profits from creating insecurity and selling solutions. Convince people their natural appearance is insufficient, sell them products to fix it. Then sell them more products to manage the problems created by the first products. It's elegant exploitation disguised as empowerment, just like Rome's beauty rituals. The gender dynamics remain depressingly constant. Women still bear primary responsibility for elaborate appearance maintenance in most contexts. Men still have contradictory opinions, wanting women to look beautiful while resenting the effort and expense required. The double bind that Roman women navigated is alive and well in modern beauty culture. The class dimensions persist too. Access to safe, professional hair care is still status dependent. Wealthy people get better dyes, better stylists, better damage control. Poor people make do with whatever they can afford, accepting higher risk of poor results. Rome's stratified beauty access has direct modern equivalents. The information sharing networks that Roman women used, the sharing of recipes and techniques among trusted friends, that's morphed into beauty YouTube, Instagram tutorials, online forums where people share experiences and advice. The medium changed, but the function remains identical. Women teaching women how to navigate beauty demands within existing systems. The ritual aspects, the precise procedures, the specialized equipment, all of that transferred into modern salon culture. The formality of the hair appointment, the specific sequences of application and processing, the trained professional managing the procedure. It's all ritualization designed to make chemical intervention feel controlled and safe. The psychological function is unchanged from Rome.
Even the wig industry continued with minimal interruption. Rome's blonde wig trade became medieval and Renaissance wig fashion, became Georgian and Victorian hairpieces, became modern wigs and extensions. The market for purchasing someone else's hair to enhance your appearance never went away. We just became slightly more discreet about the sourcing. What Rome figured out was how to normalize self-modification through systematic procedure. If you want people to accept dangerous or strange behavior, don't hide it. Systematize it. Create rituals that make it look controlled and intentional. Build institutions around it. Develop expertise. Document procedures. Make it expensive enough that only people with resources can do it properly. Suddenly, the dangerous or strange becomes normal through sheer procedural complexity. This is the secret of every bizarre beauty practice that persists across time. It's not that the practice makes sense, it's that the rituals around the practice create the appearance of sense. Systematic procedures transform absurdity into tradition. Once something has elaborate enough ritual frameworks, questioning it feels like attacking tradition rather than sensibly objecting to widespread mild poisoning. Rome's blonde hair obsession worked because Rome treated it seriously. The procedures, the expense, the expertise, the time investment all signaled that this mattered, that it was worth doing right, that it wasn't frivolous vanity, but important social performance. The ritual seriousness made the underlying absurdity invisible. When everyone agrees to perform elaborate ceremonies around self-modification, the modification becomes normal. The lack of panic. The night part of the title refers to how these practices continued without social breakdown. Women didn't rise up and refuse. Men didn't intervene to stop it. Society absorbed elaborate beauty modification into its normal functioning. The key was making it gradual and systematic. If change is managed through ritual, if disasters are handled privately, if success is publicly celebrated while failure is privately endured, then you can sustain almost any practice indefinitely. It's the same mechanism that lets modern society sustain equally bizarre practices. We accept elaborate beauty rituals, surgical modifications, chemical interventions because they're systematized and normalized through procedure. We don't panic about widespread Botox use or cosmetic surgery because it happens gradually, privately, within institutional frameworks that make it seem controlled.
Rome's insight was that collective behavior that would seem insane if described abstractly becomes normal when practiced systematically. The genius of Roman culture was taking human insecurities and building profitable, sustainable systems around them. They didn't solve the insecurity. They monetized it, ritualized it, made it into an industry that could persist across generations. Modern capitalism learned from Rome's example. You don't cure people's problems. You create elaborate systems for managing them in ways that generate ongoing revenue. The blonde hair obsession also reveals Rome's deep ambivalence about its own success. They'd conquered the world, but weren't sure Romanness was superior. The adoption of Germanic beauty standards while fighting Germanic tribes shows profound cultural confusion. Rome wanted to believe in its unique greatness while simultaneously adopting the aesthetics of people they defined as barbarians. The contradiction was managed through commerce and ritual, never resolved. This pattern of powerful cultures adopting aesthetics from people they dominate appears throughout history. European colonizers taking stylistic elements from colonized peoples. American culture appropriating from cultures it marginalizes. The psychological function is similar. The dominant culture can acknowledge the aesthetic appeal of the dominated while maintaining the power hierarchy. You can want to look like them without accepting them as equals. It's having your conquest and wearing it too. Rome's systematic approach to dangerous beauty practices influenced medical and cosmetic thinking for centuries afterward. Medieval and Renaissance beauty books copied Roman recipes, often making them worse by adding additional unwise ingredients. The fundamental approach of using alkaline compounds for hair lightening persisted until modern chemistry developed less destructive alternatives. We're still using Rome's basic chemical intuition, just with better understanding of what we're doing. The class dynamics of appearance modification that Rome established became template for European aristocracy. The idea that elite women should spend enormous time and resources on elaborate appearance maintenance while pretending it came naturally, that's direct inheritance from Roman culture. The procedures changed, but the underlying logic remained constant. Aristocratic women's value comes partly from demonstrated commitment to beauty standards ordinary women couldn't afford to meet. The documentation of Roman beauty practices in surviving texts created a tradition of written beauty advice that continues through modern women's magazines and beauty blogs. The genre of explaining elaborate procedures for achieving idealized appearance with recipes and instructions and warnings, that textual tradition is remarkably old. Rome wasn't the first, but Roman sources influenced everyone who came after. Thank you for spending these hours exploring Rome's blonde hair obsession with me. If you found value in understanding how ancient empires normalized self-destructive beauty practices,
I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to Candle History and share your thoughts in the comments. What surprised you most about Roman beauty culture? What modern parallels do you see? I read every comment and genuinely appreciate engagement with this material. We began with an empire that conquered the world, but couldn't conquer its own beauty insecurities. Hours later, you understand that Rome's blonde hair obsession wasn't just vanity. It was sophisticated cultural engineering, the systematization of desire and insecurity into profitable, sustainable institutions. It was the transformation of chemical warfare against your own body into respected beauty ritual through the magic of elaborate procedure. The modern world inherited more from Rome than aqueducts and law. We inherited the conviction that appearance requires suffering, that beauty demands ongoing maintenance, that natural features are insufficient and need correction. We inherited the commercial systems that profit from these insecurities, the expert hierarchies that manage modification procedures, the ritual frameworks that normalize otherwise bizarre behavior. Rome showed us that you can convince people to do almost anything to themselves if you systematize it properly. Make it expensive enough to signal status. Make it complex enough to require expertise. Make it gradual enough that disasters can be hidden. Create communities of practice where knowledge transfers and techniques improve. Build commerce around every stage of the process. Suddenly, the absurd becomes normal through sheer procedural sophistication. The blonde hair obsession was never really about hair color. It was about power, status, identity, the desperate human need to feel valuable in competitive social environments. Rome's aristocratic women understood that their social position depended partly on meeting appearance standards, and they were willing to pay extraordinary costs to meet those standards. The chemicals and wigs and rituals were tools for navigating social reality, not expressions of stupidity or vanity. Modern judgment of Roman beauty practices misses this functional understanding. When we laugh at Romans poisoning themselves for blonde hair, we're ignoring our own equally extreme beauty practices. Every culture develops appearance modification rituals that probably seem absurd from outside. The specific practice matters less than the underlying human drives that generate them. Insecurity, competition, desire for acceptance, need to demonstrate status. These are constants across cultures and time periods. What changes is the technology and ritual systems, not the fundamental psychology. Rome used lead and pigeon dung. We use ammonia and hydrogen peroxide. The chemistry improved, but the motivation remained identical. We still want to transform ourselves to match culturally defined beauty standards. We still build elaborate procedures to make that transformation feel controlled and legitimate. We're still Romans, just with better chemical engineering. The procedures that prevented panic were Rome's real achievement. They figured out how to sustain dangerous collective behavior across centuries without social breakdown. The secret was distribution of knowledge, gradual implementation, private failure management, public success celebration, expert hierarchies, commercial systems that scaled with demand, and ritual complexity that made everything feel intentional rather than crazy. These same mechanisms sustain modern beauty culture. We don't panic about the fact that millions of people regularly apply toxic chemicals to their hair because it happens through systematized procedures in licensed establishments with trained professionals using regulated products. The ritual complexity signals safety, whether or not the practice is actually safe. The procedures matter more than the outcome. Rome understood something profound about human social psychology. You can get people to accept almost anything if you present it through sufficient ritual and procedural complexity. Elebator ceremony makes the strange familiar. Expertise hierarchies create authority that substitutes for evidence. Commercial systems generate their own legitimacy through scale. Documentation creates tradition. Gradual implementation prevents shock. Private failure management maintains public confidence. Every modern institution that sustains questionable practices uses these same mechanisms. We've just stopped noticing because we're inside the systems. To outside observers, many modern practices would seem as bizarre as Roman blonde hair obsession. But to participants, the ritual frameworks make everything seem normal and reasonable. That's the legacy of Roman cultural engineering. The final insight is that maybe the practices don't matter as much as our human need for them. We're going to modify our appearances. We're going to pursue culturally defined beauty standards. We're going to compete through aesthetic presentation. The question isn't whether, but how, and Rome provided enduring answers. Systematize the dangerous, ritualize the absurd, commercialize the insecure, build institutions around vanity, create expertise hierarchies to manage modification, document everything to establish tradition. 2,000 years later, we're still following Rome's template. The hair dye has improved. The chemistry is safer. But the fundamental approach of transforming personal insecurity into systematic ritual remains unchanged. We learned from Rome that you don't need to solve human problems. You just need to build sufficiently elaborate procedures for managing them. The procedures become the solution, even when they don't actually solve anything. So the next time you're at a salon, sitting with chemicals on your head, timing your processing carefully under professional supervision, following procedures that have been refined across generations, recognize what you're doing. You're participating in a tradition that dates back millennia.
to Roman women sitting on rooftops with toxic paste in their hair, suffering for beauty within elaborate ritual frameworks that made the suffering feel worthwhile.
We're not smarter than Rome. We're just Rome with better chemistry and different gods. The human drives remain constant. The insecurities persist. The solutions are remarkably similar. We ritualize self-modification, systematize appearance maintenance, commercialize beauty procedures, all following patterns Rome established and perfected. The empire fell. The blonde hair obsession survived, adapted, evolved, but fundamentally continued across civilizations and centuries. That persistence reveals something about human nature that maybe we'd rather not acknowledge. We need these rituals. We need the systematic procedures that transform insecurity into managed practice. We need the elaborate frameworks that make collective behavior feel individual choice. Rome's blonde hair worked without causing panic, because Rome understood that panic comes from uncertainty, not danger. Make the dangerous feel certain through systematic procedure, and people accept it. That's the real lesson. Not the specific chemicals or techniques, but the meta-pattern of how to normalize anything through sufficient ritual complexity. And with that understanding, maybe we can look at our own cultural practices with slightly more clarity. The things we accept as normal, the elaborate procedures we follow without question, the beauty standards we pursue at personal cost, they're all manifestations of the same human patterns Rome expressed through hair lightening. Different technology, identical psychology. The past isn't dead. It isn't even past. It's alive in every hair salon, every cosmetics purchase, every moment we modify ourselves to meet standards we didn't set. Rome figured out how to systematize human insecurity into sustainable practice. We're still living in the world they created, still following their template, still pursuing blonde hair through ever more sophisticated chemistry. At least we stopped using lead. That's progress. The rest is just Rome with better ingredients.